Okay, so last time we talked about the beginnings of Israeli archaeology. This is a similar story, but it's going to go in a different direction, and that's the direction of Tanakh. Okay, we're going to see there are connections to the idea of our right to this land and Zionism, but it goes much deeper than that. And really, our question, which is still a question that we are dealing with all the time today, anybody who studies Tanakh in the modern world, anybody who knows something about archaeology, these are questions that are coming up all the time. Can Tanakh and archaeology coexist? Can one prove or disprove the other? Is the truth somewhere in the middle, right? That's what we're really going to be looking at. So I wanted to start out, we're going to look at him. We looked at him last time also, but we're going to look at him more in depth today. Yigael Yadin. Okay, Yigael Yadin, this is a quote from one of the books that he wrote. He wrote books on a lot of his different excavations, on Masada, on Bar Kokhba. He wrote a book about his dig in Chatzor. And he writes, kind of just putting it out there very plainly, our main guide was the Bible. As an archaeologist, I cannot imagine greater excitement than working with the Bible, the Tanakh in one hand and a spade in the other, right? That's where the title for this course comes from. Now, today, that's very old school. Okay, that's the way the 19th century archaeologists that we looked at, Warren and Wilson and Robinson, definitely Robinson, that's the way they looked at the world. We're going to see that that's the way that somebody named William Albright, one of the premier biblical archaeologists, looked at the world. Today, even archaeologists who define themselves as religious, as knowing Tanakh backwards and forwards, outwardly, they are not going to say that. That's not something that people say. Certainly not in a publication that's for the general public. However, saying something and wanting something are two different things, right? And if you look at the picture on the left here, this is a photograph of a bulla, right? A bulla is a seal impression, right? Anybody who was important in First Temple times had a signet ring, and they would stamp their seal into documents, into all different kinds of things. There are very, very beautiful bullae that are decorated with all kinds of animals and different pictures. Usually what we find here in Israel are just names, but it's not so just, it's actually very important. So if you look, this is a bulla that is broken. It was discovered in the Ophel excavations, the southern wall excavations. Eilat Mazar was the one who was involved in examining it, and after looking at it for a long time, the decision was made that what it says here, you can see the nice Ktav Ivri, the old Hebrew letters. The first line is pretty easy. It says Li Yeshaya, Lamed Yud Shin Yud Aleph. Right? No, sorry. Lamed Yud Shin Ayin Yud Hey. Okay, Li Yeshaya. And the next line says Nun Vet Yud, Navi. Okay, now a lot of people jump to conclusions. They said Yeshaya, oh, Yeshaya, we know who he is, and he's a Navi, he's a prophet. This clearly is his seal. We found Yeshayahu's seal. Now, it's not so far-fetched because in the same dig, from this same dig, they took out a bulla that says on it, Chizkiyahu Melech Yehuda, right? Hezekiah, the king of Judah. So to find his contemporary Isaiah is not so crazy. However, the people who are doubtful of this say, Yeshaya, fine, that's very nice. Navi, like would a prophet really, this is not his business card, would he really write Navi on the bulla? It doesn't make so much sense. It makes a lot more sense to say this is a guy named Yeshayahu who maybe he comes from a town called Nov, right? We know there's a town Nov very close to Yerushalayim. He's a Novite, right? It could be that it's Yeshayahu, but to jump to that conclusion is a little bit irresponsible. We're going to see that as we go on. But people want this to be true. Right? We want this to be correct. We want Tanakh to be proven, or perhaps you're in the other camp and you want Tanakh to be disproven. But it's a high stakes game. Okay, and we're going to talk about that as we go along. But before we start, as we usually do, let's just take a quick look at a timeline. These are names that we're going to be throwing around, so it's helpful to understand the progression of when each one comes along. William Albright, we're going to talk about him. He is a Christian Bible scholar. He's really considered to be the first of the biblical archaeologists in modern times, meaning in scientific, he's using scientific methods, but very much looking at the Bible. And he digs in a bunch of places, most significantly Tel Beit Mirsim, in the Shvela, right, in the southern part of Israel, not quite the Negev, and Tel El Ful, which is right today. It's in Beit Hanina, in the northern parts of Jerusalem, and he digs there. In the 50s, that's in the 1930s. In the 1950s, we have Yigal Yadin digging in Chatzor. He digs in a bunch of places. We're going to talk about his dig in Chatzor. The same time in the 50s, we have Kathleen Kenyon, right, British archaeologist, who digs in a few different places, but she's digging in Jordan, right? Remember, 1950s, Israel's divided. Jericho is in Jordan. She also digs in Ir David, which is in Jordan. Okay, so she digs in Jericho, in Yericho. In the 80s, we have a dig by a very influential person, very interesting person named Adam Zartal, and he digs on Mount Eval, right? In the 1990s, Israel Finkelstein, who we're going to see is on the other side of the map of this story, digs in Megiddo. Zartal we get again in the 90s, digging in a place called El Ahwat. 1993, very, very significant discovery, Beit David inscription. Don't worry, we're going to go back to all these different things, but I just want us to understand the dating, the progression. 1999, very important article by someone named Ze'ev Herzog, where he discounts a lot of biblical archaeology. And then in 2005, we have Eilat Mazar talking about King David's palace. 2 years later, Yossi Garfinkel digging in Khirbet Kayafa, also talking about King David. So just the larger picture here is a pendulum, right? The earlier years, right? The first 2/3, almost 3/4 of the 20th century, we are very much on the side of the Bible as a source. And we have kind of a backlash. The pendulum swings in the other way. And we're going to see that there is opposition to this idea and saying, no, 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 we can't trust what says in Tanakh. And today we're witnessing the pendulum swinging backwards in the direction of support for what's written in Tanakh, but with caveats, right? With saying, well, maybe we're not going to take it all wholesale. So that's just bigadol, the picture. Now, all these things are complicated by the fact that we are talking about the Jewish religion and we are talking about the state of Israel. Meaning, when ancient Assyria was being excavated in the 19th century and they found the texts of things like Enuma Elish and Gilgamesh and looked for support for these texts or for the mythology behind these texts, nobody was distressed by this. Nobody said, oh, you can't use Enuma Elish as a text. It wasn't an issue. When we're talking about Judaism, we're talking about Zionism, we're talking about the state of Israel, everything becomes much more loaded, okay, in our favor and against us. David Ben-Gurion testifying before the Peel Commission. The Peel Commission in 1937, the British attempt to partition the land. It doesn't end up happening, but they get testimony from all sorts of places. And Ben-Gurion, of course, appears before the commission. And Lord Peel, this is said over, this was the account of this story from, I think it was from Rabbi Lau. Okay, so Lord Peel said, Mr. Ben-Gurion, the Arab people have a kushan entitling them to this land. A kushan is a document proving that it's yours. Do you have a document saying that Palestine belongs to you, right? The precursor to this is that all of these Arabs are interviewed and give testimony, and they talk about, oh, we've been in this land for 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, and they ask David Ben-Gurion, they said, well, where are you from? And he says, he's from Eastern Europe. And so is Chaim Weizmann, and so is Yitzchak Ben Tzvi. And they said, well, can you say that this belongs to you? At that point, Ben Gurion became aware of the Tanakh in his hand that he swore upon whilst taking the oath to be witness to the commission. And he held it up triumphantly, exclaiming, here is your Kushan, here is your document. It is the world's most highly respected book, and I believe that you British regard it with much respect too. We must have this land. And I was considering doing a slide on this, and I didn't have too much that was visually very interesting, but Ben Gurion had Tanakh study sessions in the prime minister's house. Okay? And it was continued in the president's house, and then it stopped for a while. It was started again by Menachem Begin, and Netanyahu does it every once in a while. But Tanakh study, not in a religious sense, but in a sense of this is our land and this is the deed to our land and we better understand it. I just quoted Ben Gurion this morning in a class I was teaching on knowing Tanakh, knowing Sefer Hosea. He knew Tanakh better than probably most people who are studying 929 today. He knew Tanakh backwards and forwards, and it was part of the story here. The other side of the picture is that people will look at this and will say, well, okay, we're not interested in Jews having a part of this land, and therefore we have to discount this source. Rabbi Josh Berman, who we'll quote a little bit later when we talk about the Exodus from Egypt, he quotes somebody, a scholar, who suggests, well, maybe we shouldn't call it the Bible when we bring it as a proof. Maybe we should call it the Library of Ancient Judea, right? Just like we have the Library of Ancient Assyria. Maybe that will make it a less loaded text. So just something to be aware of. We're going to talk about a bunch of different stories. One of the most controversial topics is the story of the United Kingdom, and the kingdoms of King David, of King Solomon. How big are they? Were they really so big? Are we reading back into history a reality that only happens much later? Okay. We're going to talk about King David, and that's very significant. But just take a look at these two maps. Okay, the map on the left is basically what Tanakh tells us about King David's kingdom. Okay, and it's very large, right? It goes all the way up to Lebanon of today, to Phoenicia. It goes to Transjordan. It goes down in the south. Okay, the map on the right is from National Geographic when they did a cover story on Khirbet Qeiyafa, the city that may provide new understanding of David's power. And this map is showing us various places that are part of this story of controversy. Okay, so they're pointing out Tel Dan, where this Beit David inscription was found. Don't worry, we're going to come back to all of this. The city of David, and how much of it is really David's city. Okay, King Solomon's cities, Chatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer, Sha'araim and Qeiyafa, the story that we're going to talk about, right? Solomon's copper mines on the other side of the Jordan. And they're saying, well, wait a second, maybe we shouldn't throw away all this evidence from the Bible. This is a National Geographic from, I think it was 2008, 2009. Suddenly we're starting to find more and more evidence for what the Bible is telling us. We have to be critical. We have to look at different sides of the story. So two case studies that we're not going to look at very deeply, but just instructive. Okay? The book of Joshua, when it talks about various conquests in the land. The final conquest is in the north. Joshua and his armies go up north. The main city in the north is the city of Chatzor, a tell that is opposite today's Rosh Pina. Extensively excavated. We're going to talk about Yigal Yadin and Chatzor. The book of Joshua says that the Israelites are successful in conquering in the north, but whoever's mic is on, please mute yourself. But they burn down only one town. Mute everybody, that's going to be a pain. All right, thank you. It says all these towns are still standing on their mounds. They were not burned down by Israel. Chatzor alone, Joshua burned down. Now Yigal Yadin excavated in Chatzor. Later, his student Amnon Ben Tor in the 1990s continued excavating, and he excavated parts that Yadin did not excavate at the top of the tell, and he found this massive, super impressive building. It might be a palace, it might be a temple, it might be both. It's clearly from the Canaanite period, and it was also very clearly destroyed in a massive fire. Okay, a huge conflagration. You could see evidence of it in the mud bricks. You could see other evidence on the site. It was clearly destroyed in the 12th century. There's no other likely enemy up there in the north who would have destroyed it. And it seems very clear that this is backing up the story that we have in Sefer Yoshua. Beautiful. It works perfectly together. However, if we go down south to Yericho, okay, Kathleen Kenyon excavated in Yericho, and very famously, she did not find, she found a lot of layers. Yericho is a very, very ancient city. Okay? It's more than 10,000 years old. She found many layers of walls in the Tel of Yericho. You can go see it if you get special permission from the army. It's a very cool site. But what she didn't find are walls from the time period of Joshua. Okay, there's a gap. We have a wall from the 14th century before the Common Era, and then the city is rebuilt in the 9th century before the Common Era. But in the time period of Yoshua, 13th, 12th, 11th, no matter how you do the chronology, it's somewhere in there. We don't have a wall. What do we do with the story of Jericho in the book of Joshua? So the troops shouted when the horns were sounded, and the troops heard the sound of the horn. They raised a mighty shout, and the wall collapsed. The troops rushed into the city. Right? If there was no wall, how did the wall collapse? There are people who try to fetch out an answer. Maybe the wall was swallowed up. Maybe it was the older wall, but it's not really a satisfactory answer. So sometimes Tanakh works in with archaeology, and sometimes it doesn't. But let's go back, now that we looked at those case studies, let's go back and understand the beginnings of the story of biblical archaeology in the 20th century. Okay, we're not talking about the archaeologists of the 19th century who are just starting to kind of figure out the science of archaeology. We already have much more methodology by the time we get to William Albright. William Albright was a Christian. He was the son of missionaries. He was, on the one hand, very devout, knew a lot of Bible. On the other hand, he was a scientist. He really worked in terms of stratigraphy and understanding the layers in the tell. He dug according to the most correct methods of his time. Okay, today, almost 100 years later, we are more advanced in our science, but he certainly went according to the methods of his time. And he wants to, and I quote, illuminate, understand, and sometimes prove the Bible. Okay, for him, the Bible is a text that he's working with. The archaeology is a text that he's working with. They go together. Okay, sometimes they don't always work together, but they go together. You're looking at two different tells here. Okay? The picture on the left is a place called Tel Beit Mirsim. It's not so much on people's routes today to go visit. There's not so much to see there, but it was a very important early archaeological site where he worked on the stratigraphy and understanding the pottery from the different layers. Albright thought that it was Dvir. Right, we hear about the town of Dvir in the Nachala of Yehuda. Today, most scholars don't agree with that. And he also went to Nebi Samuel, and he said, "Oh, this is Mitzpah," which then other scholars disagreed, and today we think that it is really that. So we don't follow everything that he says. But here's another example. Take a look at the picture on the right. This is a picture of the begun but not completed palace that King Hussein of Jordan started to build on top of a hill north of Jerusalem. It's a site called Tel El Ful. Today, it's within the city boundaries of Jerusalem. It's in Beit Hanina, which is right next door to Pisgat Ze'ev. Hussein started to build a palace there because it's a fantastic view. You can see everything around you. It's really, really incredible. And then, Six-Day War. This wasn't Jordan anymore. This was Israel. The structure, the shell of the structure is still there. It's not in very good shape, but you can still go up to the roof and see the amazing view. Okay. Albright dug this, and he said he found layers from the 11th century, and he says this is a hill. It's a hill in the tribe of Benjamin. He thinks this is Givat Shaul. And there are suggestions that indeed it's Givat Shaul, but he found a sword there from the 11th century. And he says, okay, Tanakh tells us that almost nobody had swords, nobody had weapons except for Shaul and Yonatan. So here we go. We have a sword. Shaul had a sword. This is Shaul's palace. I'm simplifying. He wasn't simplistic, but very much the Tanakh and the archaeology going hand in hand. He had many significant students. He was the head of what today is called the Albright Institute. It wasn't called that then, but today it's a very respected archaeological institute in Jerusalem. And he had many students, both non-Jews and Jews and Israelis who followed in his footsteps. So he's really kind of our patriarch here. But that brings us to Yigael Yadin. He's probably the most famous archaeologist for people who don't know so much about archaeology in Israel. He very famously dug in Masada, which is where these pictures are from. He dug in the Bar Kokhba caves we talked about last time. He was not only an archaeologist, he was really a Renaissance man. He was a general, he was a politician, he was a very, very influential guy. And as we saw in the beginning from his quote, he also sees Tanakh very much as a source. And he digs, his dig in Masada is in the 60s, and it's very significant in a Zionist sense, right? Masada is not Tanakh, Masada is Second Temple period. And it's a dig that even today I guide people and they say to me, oh, my first time in Israel, I was a teenager, I came and I dug with Yigael Yadin and Masada. It was very much this Zionist experience of getting our history out of the land and who are these guys who fought for our independence. And the army used to have swearing in ceremonies on top of Masada. When they found human remains on Masada, they did a whole state funeral, right? That's very much part of the Zionist story. But Yadin is also part of the Tanakh story, okay? And he digs in Chatzor, okay? And he understands all, and he's also in Megiddo, and he wants to uncover the cities of King Solomon. Okay, sorry, why did I just do that? Undoing that. Oh, sorry. Okay, share again. Hey, what am I doing? I'm sorry, everybody. Okay. From the beginning and big. Okay. Sorry, technology problems. Okay, here we go. Okay, so Yadin also knows his Tanakh. And he knows this.
First slide. Oh, now
what?
Now we're not.
You're good? We're good?
And this is the account of the Levi. That's what we're looking at.
Yeah, that's the one. Okay, good. Thank you, Susanna. Okay, so he's reading us this pasuk. This is the account of the Levi, the Mas, which King Solomon raised to build the house of the Lord and his own house and the Milo and the wall of Jerusalem and Chatzor and Megiddo and Gezer. What are Solomon's big building projects? Obviously Jerusalem, okay, the Beit HaMikdash, his palace, and this fill, the Milo and the wall of Jerusalem. Okay, we'll look at this in a minute and understand the wall of Jerusalem. But then he's got three cities, Chatzor, Megiddo, Gezer. Does it mean that these are the only cities he builds? No, but these are his three main cities. And Yadin is going to draw a connection between these three cities. Okay, what we are looking at here is the wall that was uncovered by the excavations of Eilat Mazar and before her Binyamin Mazar at the southern wall of Jerusalem, right? Southern wall of the Temple Mount. But this is a wall that she dates to King Solomon. And there are scholars that agree with her. There are scholars that place it a few decades later, but it's clearly a first temple period wall. But we don't want to focus on that right now. We're going to come back to Eilat Mazar. We want to take a look at Chatzor. Okay, so we've got these three cities. Why these three cities? Okay, they are very strategically located. Chatzor is in the north. Megiddo is in the Jezreel Valley. We're going to call it the center because nobody goes south of Beersheba in ancient times because that's desert. So Megiddo is the center and Gezer is the south. So if you want to talk about King Solomon having a united kingdom ruling everywhere, okay, these are very logical choices. Not only that, all three of these cities were very important, very powerful Canaanite cities. So King Solomon taking them over shows Israelite or Judahite power over these places. And all of these are on the Via Maris, or on the sea route, right? Going up from the sea, crossing over the Jezreel Valley, and going out towards the northern kingdom. So these are very important places. Yadin digs in Chatzor in the 1950s. Okay? He digs in the lower city, he digs the water system, but he also digs the gates. Okay, now we've got these great gates to the city. Gates to the city in First Temple times are not just an archway. Okay, they are, a lot of action happens at the city gates. City gates are a place of commerce, they're a place of religion, they're a place where the judges sit. There's a lot happening at the city gates. Now, Yadin reads these psukim and he says, Chatzor, Megiddo, Gezer, they're all built by King Solomon, stands to reason that they are going to have a similar plan. Okay, he's involved in the dig in Megiddo. It's very hard to see this because we don't have a great picture of the gates in Megiddo because half of them were taken home by the excavators from the University of Chicago in the early 1900s. Okay, but Yadin knows that they uncovered a gate that had 6 chambers. He also knows when he looks at the reports of the excavation that McAllister did in Gezer that there's also a 6-chambered gate. I don't know if you can see it well here, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 chambers. So when he digs in Hatzor, he actually goes to the workers who are digging there and he sketches on the floor a 6-chambered gate. And he says, this is what you're going to find. And they dig and they find it, okay, which is pretty cool, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is already part of the wall, so this is not part of the gate, but we have a 6-chamber gate. And Yadin says, okay, of course, Shlomo builds all these 3. He's going to hire the same architect, the same urban planner. They're going to look the same. Clearly, they all are the same. They're all built by the same guy. They all go back to the 10th century. That's a little bit of circular logic, right? Saying that these look the same, so they must be built by the same guy, so they're from the same time period. Not necessarily. We find chambered gates and even 6-chambered gates from other time period. But Yadin has no question that this is clearly all by King Solomon. Just a spoiler alert today that we've done more digs. Basically, pretty much everyone agrees that the gate in Gezer is from King Solomon because they found a building next to it that was destroyed in the 9th century when we know Paro Shishak comes and destroys a lot of King Solomon's cities. So if it was destroyed in the 9th century by Shishak and the top layer is the same as the gates, that makes the top layer concurrent with King Solomon. Chatzor, same thing. We found a building that we can date to the mid to the 950s to King Solomon, so the gates are dated to then as well. Okay, Megiddo, the jury's still out. Some people think they are Solomonic gates. Some people say no. But so far, Yadin was 2/3 right. Okay, as far as we know. Okay, we're going to leave aside Yadin and Chatzor for a little bit, and we're going to go to somebody very different. This is Adam Zartal. Adam Zartal is a fascinating guy. And he's not really the same generation as Yadin. He only starts as an archaeologist in the late 70s. But I put him in here because his main dig that we're going to talk about is in the 80s. So just in terms of chronology, it fit nicely. Adam Zartal, until he was almost 40 years old, archaeology was not on his radar. He was a writer. He was doing all sorts of different things. In the Yom Kippur War in 1973, he fought and he was wounded very badly. And he spent a year in the hospital in rehab in Shipum. And in that time, he decided he wanted to become an archaeologist, which is really crazy when you think about it, because an archaeologist is field work, right? An archaeologist, you have to be out there. And he was on these crutches. This is how he walked after he got out of the hospital in the mid 70s. But he was an incredibly determined man. And he walked miles upon miles upon miles. He outwalked everybody. His first major project that he does is he does a survey of Samaria, Seker Har Shamron. He spends 11 years basically traversing Samaria. A survey is not a dig. A survey is when you walk across and you see what looks interesting, what could maybe be something. Maybe someone could dig here, right? Giving you the potential for decades of archaeological work. And he just logged hundreds and hundreds of miles doing that. Um, but in the course of doing that, he came upon a very interesting site. And in 1982, he begins to dig on Mount Eval. Mount Eval, one of the twin mountains that flank the city of Shechem. The other mountain is Mount Gerizim. In the Torah, we hear about these mountains as the mountains of the blessings and the curses, right? Moses says, when you come into the land, you're going to give the blessing and the curse on Har Gerizim and Har Eval. Okay. And Zartal starts to dig on Eval. Why? Because he finds this strange looking site. It didn't look like this. It was all covered over. It was literally put into Geniza. It was covered up so that it wouldn't be harmed. And they uncover it, and this is his sketch of what they found. Now, he wasn't quite sure what it was. Okay, there was this four-cornered, right, this rectangular thing on the top with different corners. There was an element around it. There was a ramp going up. And Zertal, like a lot of these guys, was not a religious man. He might have known Tanakh, but he definitely did not know rabbinic texts. And the expedition was staying in a religious community in the Shomron. Remember, this is in the 80s already. There are Jewish communities there. And at dinner one night, he's like thinking about this. He doesn't know what he's found. And he kind of sketches it on a napkin. And one of the members of the community who was working with him, religious guy, he gets very excited. He jumps up from the table. He runs out of the room. He runs back. He had gone to the Beit Midrash. He brings back an illustrated Mishnah, right? Mishnah Midot. And he opens it up and he shows him the picture of the altar of the Mizbeach. He says, you found a Mizbeach. That's what it looks like. It has the ramp. It has the sovav, this part around around it goes around. It has the corners. You found a Mizbeach. And it was this combination of Zertal's archaeological knowledge, and then he actually worked with Rabbi Yoel ben Nun, who helped him a lot on the Tanakh and the rabbinic knowledge. And they found this structure that basically, based on the things that they found there, including this scarab, which scarabs are these Egyptian insignias of different paros, and this one goes back to Ramses II, meaning what most people accept as the paro of the Exodus. Okay, so we can date this to soon after the Exodus. It's clearly an altar. He found bones underneath, only kosher bones. Interestingly, not only bones that of animals we give for sacrifice, meaning it wasn't just cows and sheep and goats. He also found yachmurim, which I'm blanking on the word in English for that, but it's also a kosher animal, but it's not an animal we use for sacrifices. Okay, and he says this is it. This is the Har Eval that we hear about in the book of Joshua. At that time, Joshua built an altar on Mount Eval as Moses had commanded the Israelites, an altar of unhewn stone. That's what this is. These are not hewn stones. They offered on it burnt offerings to God. And brought sacrifices of well-being. Okay, now not everybody agreed with him, but his findings are pretty impressive, right? Both the fact that this was used for a few decades and then covered up and never used again, meaning this was not a town, this was not a permanent temple, this was something that was made for a specific purpose. The dating of it, the fact that it's clearly something connected to Jews because it has kosher animals, right? It's a very interesting thing. But just to go back to our very first slide for a minute, a year or two ago, 2022, there was big news that somebody had discovered a curse tablet at the site. They had gone back to Eval's findings, to Zertal's findings. They looked through and they found this tablet that nobody had looked at carefully enough, and they could read that it says, the God of Israel curses so-and-so. And this made big headlines until scholars who really were experts in writings in epigraphy, they started looking at it and they're like, this is very much wishful thinking. Okay? These letters are not there. This is, and once it was peer reviewed, it did not really pass muster. So again, you can, and in some ways, those kinds of headlines are the most distressing, because when you have something real, right, you don't want it to be diluted by wishful thinking, because then people will say, oh, it's all wishful thinking. No, this is really something real. So Zertal was really considered a maverick kind of an archaeologist. But this is a pretty strong finding. Now, he had a different finding, which is less accepted, but also very interesting. A site in the north. I brought you this just to get a sense of where it is. Okay, today there's a big new Israeli city called Harish, kind of on Route 6. Okay, as you're going up towards Wadi Ara, right, towards the Iron Valley. Right next to it is a small kibbutz called Katsir. And on the outskirts of Katsir is this kind of a strange looking site. And Zartal had heard about it in a survey, and he decided to excavate here. And he found a site that doesn't really look like anything Canaanite or Philistine or Israelite. It's a site that has very thick, like 5-6 meters thick walls, kind of wavy walls, towers, these tunnels that are dead ends that don't seem to go anywhere. Okay, the site is called Al Ahwat, and he couldn't figure out what it was. It didn't fit, right? A lot of archaeology is, well, what fits with patterns that we already know? And this didn't fit into any pattern. And when you have a puzzle, you ask all sorts of people. And he had all sorts of people come to the site and look at it. And somebody came and said, you know what? This looks like a lot like a site that is found in Sardinia. Okay, Sardinia off the coast of Italy. Okay, and there's a people there called the Nuragi, and their stuff looks a lot like this El Ahwat. And Zartal flew there and he looked and he studied with the Italian scholars that were there, and he came to a very interesting conclusion. He said this site, which dates to 13th, 12th century before the Common Era, he thinks it was built by a mercenary army coming from Sardinia. Now, we know that there are people called the Sea Peoples, right? We think of the Plishtim, the Philistines, but actually in Egyptian texts that list the different kinds of invaders that are coming from the sea, it's not just the Philistines, there are others as well. One of them are called the Shardona. Shardona, Sardinia, sounds very similar. And Zertal suggests that these guys, the Shardona, who are led by Sisra, remember Sisra from the Devorah and Barak story, okay, he builds a town called Charoshet Goyim. We don't know where this is. Zartal says maybe this is Charoshet Goyim. And this is Sisra's chariot city. He uses his chariots to go out to fight against Barak. If you remember the story, he has to flee. His chariot gets bogged down in the valley. He has to flee. He's then beheaded by Yael. We won't go into the whole story, but among the finds that Zartal finds, he finds this very interesting, we could call it a hubcap, right? It's a linchpin for a chariot wheel. Okay? Very beautiful, very decorated, and it gives us a hint that there are chariots there. Now, not everybody agrees with this story, but basically it's very interesting because he has this mysterious story of the battle, a site we don't know where it is. And here's the site, and he's thinking very creatively, using Tanakh, using archaeology, putting the pieces together. Okay, so up until now, we were really talking about people who are working with Tanakh and archaeology kind of hand in hand. In 1999, like I said, you have a pendulum swing. All right, an archaeologist named Zev Herzog, who had worked with Yadin, who had worked with Yochanan Aharoni, who we talked about last week. He did his own digs in Tel Beersheba and in Jaffa. And he writes an article in the weekend supplement of the Haaretz newspaper. And he wrote it in Hebrew, obviously, but it was translated. And it sends shockwaves through the biblical community, not the biblical community, the biblical scholars community and the archaeologist community. And basically, he starts out his article, it's very much like grabs you right in the beginning, with this. This is what archaeologists have learned from their excavations in the land of Israel. The Israelites were never in Egypt. They didn't wander in the desert. did not conquer the lands in a military campaign, and did not pass it on to the 12 tribes of Israel. Perhaps even harder to swallow is the fact that the united monarchy of David and Solomon, which is described by the Bible as a regional power, was at most a small tribal kingdom. And it will come as an unpleasant shock to many that the God of Israel, Jehovah, had a female consort, and that the early Israelite religion adopted monotheism only in the waning period of the monarchy and not at Mount Sinai. And then he goes on, and it's like a 3-4 page article, and he basically dissects, and he says we have no evidence of the patriarchs, and we have no evidence of the Exodus, and etc., 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 etc. And this is understandably very disturbing to many people, and there are a lot of counter articles that are written, but he kind of puts it out there that, well, we haven't proven all of these things. Now, what many people say, and this is actually very interesting because here we are 25 years later, many people say, well, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? Just because we haven't found it doesn't mean we haven't found it yet. And that's a lot of what we are finding out today, that we haven't found it yet. Okay? But even so, this is kind of a push to say, well, wait a second, let's look at our Tanakh stories more carefully. Now, one of the scholars who's very much identified with this movement of saying all those early stories, they're written much later, is this handsome fellow here, Professor Yisrael Finkelstein of Tel Aviv University, who digs in Shiloh, who digs in Megiddo, and he is probably most famous for talking about high chronology versus low chronology, right? What does that mean? High chronology basically says that what we think, when we look at a site and we say, this is from the 950s, right? The 10th, 9th century before the Common Era, that's King Solomon. And therefore, when we look at Megiddo, we look at Chatzor, and we can date it to that time, that's really King Solomon. And Finkelstein comes along and says, no, you've messed up your dating. What you think is 9th, 10th century, it's really 8th century, 9th, 8th century. And what you think is King Solomon, no, it's really Achav. Now, this is important because some places have misquoted Finkelstein, right? For example, Al Jazeera once had him on as an interviewer, and they said to him, well, are you saying that there is no, the Zionist claim that the Jews were in the land of Israel from the time of the Bible is not true, right? That's what you're saying. He's saying, no, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that everything is 100, 150 years later than what you think. Okay? And that the stories of David and Shlomo, which show this very, very powerful United Kingdom, really they were written later and project back in time. Okay, and that's really what he is very famous for. So what we're going to do in the remaining time we have, which is not enough time, but we're going to look at a few different controversies. Okay, one of them is the story of the Exodus. A couple of years ago, 2016, the Israel Museum had a wonderful exhibit called Pharaoh in Canaan, right? Paro in Canaan, which basically looked at Egyptian influence in the land of Israel in the centuries before the stories of the Exodus and of Joshua, not before the Exodus, before the story of the Hitnachalut, right, the settlement in the land. And they brought in all these amazing artifacts from Beit She'an and from Yaffo, all this evidence of Egyptian presence in the land, as well as, Semitic presence in Egypt. It was very, very nice. But then you came into the room that was supposed to be about the Exodus, and it was an empty room. Okay, there were no artifacts in the room. There was only a movie. Okay, and the movie was Finkelstein and various other scholars talking about the cultural impact of the Exodus, meaning for Jews, the story of the Exodus is incredibly important. The Passover Seder, and then later cultural influences, right? The slaves in America and the idea of freedom and all very nice things, but basically saying, this is a lovely story, but we have no evidence of it. Okay, and this is very much part of this same idea. Now, other scholars look, right, and particularly religious scholars, so Rabbi Joshua Berman, who we mentioned before, Rav Amnon Bazak from Yeshivat Har Etzion, and they look back at these stories, not just the Exodus, that's what we're going to talk about, but also the Avot and the Hitnachalut, and they say, there might not be evidence, the Paros are not writing about the Hebrews escaping and the makot, right? Why would they write about it? Kings only write about things that are good for them. They don't write about their defeats. But the details of the story are so clearly suffused with that time and place. How could they not have been written by those people and for those people? So just to give you a few examples, and I've done a whole class on this for Pesach, so I'm not going to do too much, right? But so important in the story. Moshe has his staff, right? His mateh, he takes it everywhere. Why? Why is it such a big deal? Why does he need to do all the miracles with this staff? Because that's what the Egyptian paros have. They have a staff, right? Here's our nice staff. Any picture that you have of a pyro, male, female, doesn't matter. They always have some kind of a staff. So when Moshe comes before the pyro, he needs a staff as well. Okay, this is not something that would have too much resonance for a Judahite audience in the 7th century, but it has a lot of resonance for somebody who knows Egypt. Okay, another example, right? What does Moshe turn his staff into? He turns it into a snake that then eats all the other snakes. What is the symbol that the paro has on his crown? It's called the uraeus. You have a snake, right? And in general, the gods of Egypt, the god of the Nile, the Taninim, right? The crocodiles, all of these elements come out in the story of the 10 plagues, in the story of the power that Moshe and Aaron have, right? They're very much resonant throughout the story. They are meant to say, we know you, Egypt. We know what you think is your power, and our God is stronger than that. Rabbi Berman has written a very interesting article. Again, not everybody accepts it, but it's a very interesting article. Talks about Ramses II, his greatest victory is in a battle called the Battle of Kadesh. And in order to show this, victory that he has a battle scene of the Battle of Kadesh. You can see the drawing of it here on the walls of his temple, the Ramesseum. Okay, and there's a whole poem about it. And Rabbi Berman says, Shirat Hayam lifts a lot of elements of that poem. But what's the idea? The idea is that the greatness does not belong to Ramses, the greatness belongs to God, right? God is the king, and only somebody who knew these scenes, who knew these pictures, who knew these poems would that have meaning for. So that's our Exodus story. Okay? A story that's closer to home is the story of King David. King David, like we said, right? King David looms very, very, very large in Tanakh, both David himself, right? We have 2 books about him. We have Tehillim, and then, of course, Beit David, the house of David, Mashiach. We have imagery of David. This is a picture of David from a mosaic in a synagogue in Gaza in the 6th century. But the question for a long time, right, with these archaeologists that are kind of taking this idea apart is, well, is David really a real figure, or is he kind of like this King Arthur mythological figure? Now, that idea that there was no real David was essentially disproved in 1993. There was an excavations that were done for a long time in Tel Dan in the far north, led by Avraham Biran of Hebrew Union College, and he discovered fragments of a monumental stela, a monumental inscription by Hazael, the king of Aram, where he tells a story about how he defeated Yoram ben Achav, the king of Israel, and Achaziah. It's not so clear if it says Achaziah, but that would fit with Tanakh, from Beit David. Okay, you can actually see it very nicely. It's not white in the original, obviously, but this is outlined, right? Beit David, even if you don't know the ancient Hebrew letters, you've got these nice dalids, right? These triangles, the deltas, okay? Beit David, if you have, and we can date this inscription to the 9th century, because we know when Hazael Melech Aram ruled, we have other inscriptions of his. If there is a house of David in the 9th century, then chances are there was a David in the 10th century. Okay, so by the time this was discovered in 1993, so there's no more question anymore that there was a historical David. But the question is, Well, how powerful was he? Was he really a strong king? Was he kind of like just some tribal chieftain? Did he really rule in lots of places? And that's where we get to more recent discoveries. So in the 2000s, Eilat Mazar, who we mentioned last time, right? Benjamin Mazar's granddaughter, but also a very important excavator in her own right. She digs in the city of David at the very top of the hill. She finds massive walls that she dates to the 10th century based on the pottery that she finds there. Okay? And she says, who is powerful enough in the 10th century to build a huge building at the top of the hill? Clearly only the king. This must be King David's palace. Now, people didn't like this very much because she said, before she found it, she says, I'm going to find it. Because she looked at Tanakh and she looked at Sefer Shmuel, right? And in Sefer Shmuel, after David conquers the city of David, right? And he builds himself a new palace. So then it says, "Vayishmu plishtim ki mashchu et David melech Yisrael." The Philistines heard that David had been appointed king over Israel, anointed king over Israel. Vayalu kol plishtim levakesh et David. They come after him. Vayishma David vayered el hamitzudah. He goes down to the fortress where Eilat Mazar dug was above what many scholars think is the fortress of Zion, is the Mitzudah that the Jebusites had that David conquered. Okay? And if his palace is above, then he has to go down to the fortress. So she digs above, she finds a massive building. She says this is his palace. Not everybody agrees. It was somewhat controversial, but it is an interesting suggestion. Okay, around the same time, a couple of years later, there is a ranger for the Antiquities Authority named Sar Ganor, and he comes across a very interesting site a little bit south of Beit Shemesh, which has a circumference, 700-meter circumference, complete wall. Okay, and the wall can be dated to biblical times. I'm not going to say the date yet. We're going to get to that. Not only is it a complete wall, it's the largest complete wall we have from biblical times. It's a very nice casemate wall, right? You can see these like rooms inside the wall. This is a classic Judean city. We find this in Tel Beit Mirson, we found it in Tel Sheva, we found it in a lot of places. And it's got two lovely gates. It's got a gate in the south and it's got a gate in the west. And this site was being excavated by somebody named Yossi Garfinkel. He begins to excavate. First, they find one gate, okay, facing west. They don't know what this site is. They know it's a fortified city. It's a well-planned city. It's a city that is not inhabited for a very long time. It's for 3-4 decades, and then it's abandoned, and it's only got one other layer of settlement much later in Hellenistic times. He finds one gate facing west, facing towards the Philistines, but they keep on digging, and they find a second gate facing south. Now, that's very unusual. You don't find biblical cities that have two gates. A gate is a weak point. You wouldn't want to have two. But we hear in the book of Joshua and in the book of Samuel about a place called Sha'arayim. Okay, one gate is a sha'ar. Two gates, right? Think of Mishkafayim or Ofanayim. Two gates is Sha'arayim. Maybe, and it fits very nicely, right? In the description in the book of Joshua, it tells us in the Nachalot, Eshtaol Tzora, Ashnaz Anoch, Enganim Tapuach, Enam Yarmut, Soko Azerka Sha'arayim. It's very close to all those places that we've identified already. This fits. Is this Sha'arayim? So that's already a very interesting question. But the next question is, when is it from? Okay, now you can date things based on pottery, and they did find pottery that fits with a 10th century BCE date, okay, meaning David HaMelech. They also found 4 olive pits. Olives are carbon-based material, therefore you could do carbon dating on them. And they did carbon dating, and they go basically 1050 to 950. Carbon dating is not an exact science, but it puts us in the vicinity of the time period of King David. Okay, very nice. Now we know when it's from, but whose town was it? Was it a Canaanite town? Was it a Philistine town? Was it a Judahite town? I'm going through this very quickly, but just to understand, how do we determine that? So you need to look for certain clues. Maybe the writing is going to help us. So we have Old Hebrew writing. The problem is everybody in our area uses Old Hebrew writing. But what does it say? So they found one ostraca, one piece of pottery with writing. So far, nobody has successfully deciphered what it says. They also found writing on a pottery jug, which is actually really nice and it's beautifully written. And it says, Eshbaal ben Bidan. This is the jar that belongs to Eshbaal. Eshbaal ish Baal. You say Baal, Canaanite. That's not good. No, Dafka, when we find Baal, it's a good chance that it is an Israelite or a Judite name because we worship the Baal. What can we do? That we know is true. Okay. Can also look at things. Do we have anything that shows us about the religion of the place? So we have these little miniature shrines, a few of them. They don't have idols in them. That's already interesting, saying maybe we're transitioning to a monotheistic religion. Okay, but we also have these doorways, one within the other, within the other, within the other. This is how the Navi describes the doorway of the temple. Okay, it has chamishit, mizuzot chamishit, doorway within doorway within doorway. Could this have been a prototype, a model for what the temple is going to look like? And a lot of this is questions, right? We also don't have any evidence that these people did what the Philistines like to do, which is drink beer and eat pigs. Okay? We don't have pig bones. We don't have vessels that were used to filter out the hops for the beer. So is this a place that was Philistine? Probably not. Is it a place that was Israelite or more accurately Judahite, belonging to the tribe of Judah? Maybe, but it might have been Canaanite. We don't know 100%. Yossi Garfinkel says this is an outpost of King David. He wasn't powerful only in Jerusalem. He was powerful all the way out towards Beit Shemesh. Not only that, he built a very well-planned city, okay? Nice walls, protection, gates. We have these very interesting jar handles with thumbprints in them. We think this was an early version of tax collecting, right? You got these special jars and you broke off, this was your receipt, like the Lamelech handles that we have later in history. So if this belonged to King David, it shows that his power actually really extends much further than we had thought before. Okay, so let's kind of sum up a little bit. We've gone from sort of taking Tanakh wholeheartedly and saying, okay, everything Tanakh tells us is true. We just have to find the evidence for it, to going in the other direction and saying, no. At least the first 2/3 of Tanakh, nice little stories, tell them at bedtime, but there's nothing out there in the real world. And today we've kind of swung back in a different direction where we say, okay, we're going to take, like we say in Hebrew, be'eravon mugbal, right? We're going to take with a grain of salt. We don't take everything that Tanakh says 100%, right? Did King Solomon really have 1,000 wives, right? There are many things that are clearly exaggerated great numbers, but we're going to take it more seriously. And we're going to look and we're going to try to understand. And we're finding all sorts of fascinating things. So I'm going to leave you with two very recent discoveries. Okay. This is in Lachish. Okay. Lachish was the second most important city in Judah after Jerusalem. We got another 6-chambered gate, by the way. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This one is like what we think it looked like, although we've now found it. So this is an old picture. This is not from the time of King Solomon. This is from the time of King Hezekiah. Okay. But in one of the chambers, they found a temple because we had temples at the gate. And inside the inner sanctum of the temple, they found a toilet, an unused toilet, which is something that we hear about in the book of Kings, right? We hear that, first of all, King Hezekiah got rid of the false, the idolatrous temples, and we hear that toilets were put in temples so that they would become desecrated, right? It's a great example of two stories in Tanakh that are proven here in the archaeology, right? The other one is a very recent discovery. It was in the news like 2 months ago. In the city of David now, they are uncovering a First Temple period house, 7th century before the Common Era. In it, they found these huge vats that had residue of wine. That's not very exciting. What's exciting is that they found that the wine had traces of vanilla. Okay, that's really cool because vanilla does not grow in the land of Israel. Vanilla comes from South Arabia. And it tells us that we had trading contacts. Remember the Queen of Sheba? We had trade contacts. This is a powerful empire. So more and more, we keep on finding out more and more things, and it's very exciting. And we just did the tip of the iceberg here. Let's take a look at all of these new comments. Okay. Once heard Albright speak, he was very boring. I'm sorry to hear that. He was important though. Rav Lau said the Kushan that the Arab people had, it's not a midrash. Rav Lau is telling it in a very nice way, but it's shown in a lot of different places. It's a very well-known story. And the Arabs had a Kushan, meaning they've been on the land. They are on the land. They're living on the land. They've lived there for generation upon generation upon generation. That's really what Peel was referring to. And they have centuries of settlement on the land. And Ben Gurion is saying, okay, that's very nice, but we have this document that goes back thousands of years. National Geographic, I have it in my files. I don't remember. I think it's 2009, December 2000. I don't remember exactly. If you write me an email, I'll find it for you. Okay, you're talking about Jericho. Could it have been a little wall? Yes, maybe, but when we talk about the spies coming and they're like, whoa, these are scary places, how little, right? Dating is off, right? Biblical dating is very, very complicated. I'm not even going to go there, but yes, there's a whole school of thought that redates everything and changes it. I'm not going in there. Okay, Albright taught a course at YU that is very interesting. Yeah, that's I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall. Gezer is a site that you can visit. Oh, thank you. Somebody found the National Geographic, December 2010. Very nice. Thank you for being helpful. Gezer can be visited. It is not officially a national park, meaning it doesn't have a normal road to go there, but it's very worth visiting. Okay, thank you, Yachmor. See, it's good to have all these very smart people in our class. Yachmor is a fallow deer. Okay, I don't understand this comment, so I am not going to answer it. Rabbi Berman, not Ari, not Saul, Rabbi Joshua Berman, Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman, as he calls himself. I mean, not he calls himself, he earned his doctorate. Yeah, the Tel Dan is now in the Jewish Museum. I actually just saw an article about it now. Yes, go see it. Jewish Museum, having archaeology. That's very unusual. Okay, thank you. Anybody else have other comments, have other questions?
What did you say about the Kenyan? How long did you say that the city of Jericho wasn't inhabited?
I believe that there's no layer between the 14th century and the 9th century, okay, which is actually very interesting because in the Book of Kings, right, it tells us about how nobody builds until the time of Achav, Chiel Beit Ha'eli. So that part fits very nicely, but the destruction of the wall doesn't fit. Kayafa is not a national park, but it is definitely a site that you can go to, and it's an amazing, amazing site. Very, very worth going to. Also, not a wonderful road to get there. If you go in the winter, it's a beautiful hike. Okay, thank you, everybody. Have a beautiful Shabbat and a wonderful Hanukkah, and we will reconvene in 2 weeks.
Thank you,
תודה רבה,
Shulie.
שבת שלום וחג שמח.
Thank
Chag
you.
Urim Sameach.
Thank you.
Well, be safe.
Thank you, Shulie.
Thank you.